basic facts of the first president of the United States of America, George Washington. So George Washington was born into a middle-class family. He wasn't poor, but he was not a Virginia elite as most would think and depicted of George Washington. However, when he was 8 years old, his childhood home had burned down and his father died at age 11, so he couldn't really go to Britain and get all the military and British education that most people of his class, even with middle class standards, would have received at that time. So he actually said self-education. He outscoped the lands for other people, which he eventually was granted part of those lands. And then he also married Martha, who was a widow of the Virginia elite at that time, gaining him more land and slaves. And then his stepbrother with the Mount Vernon estate that he had been granted at his brother's passing, also granted him, of course, an estate with more slaves. And so, of which case now he was the Virginia elite because of his choices that he made socially. Now, however, he did love his wife in the standards after he had grown to attachment during the years of marriage. However, when he first married Martha, of course, he did have feelings for another, which was his best friend George Fairfax, his wife, who was Sally Fairfax, who actually, of course, did not also appreciate his affection, and so it showed him to be a very bitter man. However, through all his destructions as a child, such as his house burning down at 8, his father dying at 11, and people not feeling the same affection for him, actually showed him to be more of a self-trusted man, meaning so when he'd go into war, he was very brave and courageous. He didn't really fear many things because he had already experienced a lot of post-traumatic stuff. So, I mean, if PTSD had been around at this time, I'm pretty sure he would have that. However, that's a personal opinion. That's not a fact, as with the other things that I've said. When he was actually a major in the Virginia militia, he had gone to deliver a note to the French in the Ohio River Valley that he and 10 to 12 other people had gone, of course, to deliver this message to him. When he came back with the message, he was part of the Virginia militia who fought also with the British regulars under General Braddock. General Braddock was actually mortally wounded, along with most of the officers at that time, George Washington being one of the very only ones that had not suffered any actual pains. He was shot through the hat, through the clothes, but none of it actually impaled any of his skin. So he actually took command of General Braddock's forces, led them out of the massacre of the French and Indians ambush, and also brought General Braddock out of the situation. So he was seen as very courageous because he wasn't hurt and he was willing to put himself on the line to not only save one individual man, but a whole troop squad of people that the commander was over. Now, during his his Indian and French battles that he had, and through the messages through the Ohio River, there was actually a journal that was published, which is the George Washington Journal of the Ohio River Valley, which really upplayed his successes and very much downplayed his mistakes, which is most journals that military soldiers or military generals and like that will publish will more put them in the spotlight rather than putting them down, which is mostly acceptable regarding, of course, who it was George Washington. So the British regulars saw him as a very brave man, and of course the colonial patriots later on during the American Revolution, which was the same. Now, George Washington was, of course, everybody thinks of him as the very honest man. The whole cherry tree story, meaning, he told his mother that I cannot lie, I chopped down the cherry tree. However, he was a deceptive man when he had to. He actually did not cut down a cherry tree and not tell a lie. That's just something that one of his bibliographers told about him to try and up his story, to make him seem more of a greater man than he was. Not saying that he wasn't great, but to overplay George Washington. So, when he was about 100 men during one of the times of the Revolutionary War, he had about 100 men, about 100, 120, He actually gave a note to the British note spy saying that he had about 40,000 men, which is a ridiculous number. Even if he had anywhere near that number, 40,000 was a massive army. So made the British think that he had about 10, 11,000. And then later reporting that he had about 9,000 men when he was still up at about 100 to about 80 military soldiers at that time because the recruitment was up. So the British did not attack him because he believed that they had about 9,000 men, which of course he did not. But his deception made it so that they weren't attacked, so they could eventually gain more recruitments and would win the Revolutionary War. Now, through all that greatness, he was still somewhat of a bad man. So he was very racist man. He had about 30,000 slaves, thousands, and would eventually gain more. He actually had one slave who had run away, which some slaves did at that time, because there was in Philadelphia a act that was pushed through saying if you had a slave for more than 60 days, that you had to set them free. So he'd send slaves back and forth across the state line, so that way every 60 days he could have slaves. One of the slaves that had run away, of course, though, was a young lass who had said that she would not return unless George Washington did not enslave her children. George Washington saw that beneath him because he was president at the time of this happening, because he was in the executive mansion in Philadelphia. Yes, the White House did not exist at that time. However, of course, there was still an executive mansion in Philadelphia, which George Washington presided in during his first term, and then, of course, residing to his Mount Vernon estate during his older years. So she did not come back because he did not agree to not enslave her children, and he let it go after a while because he didn't want to be perceived as the very bad man. However, he did do one good thing on his deathbed. In his last will and testament, he stated that all his slaves be freed and be educated, but this would only come into effect after his wife Martha passes away. His wife Martha being very fearful for her life because she felt as if the slaves may now have an endeavor to have her killed or die. She released them free, so none of them were educated underneath the will of George Washington. Now, George Washington, though, was given the Commander-in-Chief title. He was also given the presidency. He did not run for it. He was actually delivered a note at Mount Vernon saying that he had won the president election because he was actually the president of the Constitutional Convention at that time, which James Madison wrote the majority or helped draft the majority of the Constitution. He stood about 6'2" and weighed about 150 to about 175 pounds. So he was a very strong statured man. He was actually convinced to run for a second term. He decided after that second term, though, of course, to step down from his position. During his 2 terms, though, he did throw down an alcohol rebellion, which is known as Shays' Rebellion, which was an old cry of no taxation without representation. Of course, they have representation underneath the Constitution. It's just, of course, people and their liquor is a very sensitive subject, which is like the 18th Amendment and regarding the 27th Amendment, which you will get into later about prohibition happening during the Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover administration. George Washington, though, did design the first presidential cabinet, which is like the presidential advisory, because in the Constitution it does not state how to run the executive office, just states what powers he has, but not necessarily how to do the day-to-day basis of the presidency of the United States. So he actually created a cabinet of 5 members, 4 of which still basically exist. The other one disbanded after about 2 years into the presidency of the first term. These were, of course, well-trusted men, educated and well-respected men, being the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of War, which would now be the Secretary of Defense, who was Henry Knox, the Attorney General, which is Edmund Randolph, and then, of course, you had the Secretary of the Treasury, who is Alexander Hamilton, who you can find on the $10 bill. You can also find Jefferson on the $2 bill. And then the 5th one, which is something that's been expanded or more sucked into the Secretary of War now, which is called the Secretary of Defense, which is the Postmaster General, who was Samuel Osgood. Washington's death more resulted from a severe case of flu virus that he had gotten, which has also caused his throat to swell up and to close, and then also a mix of malpractice. So they used what was called a scarifier, which helped bleed out the patient, thinking that it would stop the swelling. No blood, can't swell. However, it increased the swelling and it sent George Washington into shell shock. George Washington died at 10:20 p.m. on December 14th of 1799 at the age of 67 years old. He also had wooden teeth. Is a very common folklore. He actually had the teeth of ivory, slave teeth that he had purchased from his slaves, gold, lead, and ivory. If there's any more information that you might know, you may leave below, or you may come and state your opinion of any of the facts that I've given to you today. All of these facts, except the PTSD, that's my personal opinion, come from documentaries, articles, newspapers, and speeches George Washington published.